Good day, everyone. My name is Jean Andrea J. Suarez, and I will be talking about Section 9, and which is the divisible obligation and indivisible obligation. Also, we will know what is divisible thing and indivisible thing. Not just that, there are also three kinds of division that we will know today. The first one is the quantitative, the second one is the qualitative, and the third one is the ideal or intellectual. Today, we will talk about the Section 5, which is the divisible and indivisible obligation. So first, it states here in Article 1223, the divisibility or indivisibility of the things that are the object of obligation in which there is only one debtor and only one creditor does not alter or modifies the provisions of Chapter 2 of this title. So first, we will talk about the divisible obligations. So divisible obligations are those which have as their object a prestation, which is susceptible of partial performance without the essence of the obligation being changed. An example here is an obligation is to deliver 10 sacks of rice. Another example we have here, A agreed to pay B a 4,000 in 2 equal monthly installments for his debt. The obligation of A is divisible because it is capable of partial performance. So how we can say, or when we can say that it is divisible or it is capable of partial performance. As you can see in the example, it was said there that A will pay B the 4,000 into 2 equal monthly installments. So it was said there that partially he will not pay the 4,000 fully. So we can say that it is a partial performance when A agreed to pay B 4,000 in monthly installments, in not full amount and not certain date. So that is there we can say that it is divisible. So next we will talk about the indivisible obligations. Indivisible obligations, on the other hand, are those which have as their object a prestation which is not susceptible of partial performance, because otherwise the essence of the obligation will be changed. So as you can see, the indivisible is the opposite of the divisible obligation. So for example, I have here A agreed to sing B a happy birthday song for 50 pesos. The object in their contract is not capable of partial performance. Hence, it is an indivisible obligation. So why we can say that it is not capable of partial performance? Simply because a happy birthday song should be sing until the end of the line. It should be performed whole, or it should be sing whole and not partial. So A agreed to sing B a happy birthday song. It is an indivisible obligation. And now let's move forward to divisible thing. A thing is divisible when, if separated into parts, its essence is not changed or its value is not decreased disproportionately, because each of the parts into which it is divided are homogeneous and analogous to each other as well as to the thing itself. So we have here an example for divisible thing. D agreed to pay 2 million to C in 4 monthly installments. The obligation of D is divisible because it is capable of partial performance. But if the agreement is that D will pay C on a certain date full amount of 2 million, the obligation is indivisible. Although money is physically divisible because the intention of the parties is that the obligation must be fulfilled at one time and as a whole, not partially. The divisibility of an obligation should not, therefore, be confused with the divisibility of the thing which is the object thereof. Also, it will only be called indivisible thing if D decided to pay the 2 million fully one at a time on a certain date. Next, let's move forward to indivisible thing. A thing is indivisible when, if separated into parts, its essence is changed or its value is decreased disproportionately. So we also have an example for indivisible thing. The situation is S obliged himself to deliver to B a specific car on November 15. This obligation is indivisible because it is not capable of partial performance. The car must be obviously be delivered at one time and as a whole. Suppose the agreement is that S will deliver one half of the car on November 15 and the other half on November 30. It would be inconceivable that B would agree to a partial performance of the obligation. But let us just assume he did agree. Will the obligation be divisible or indivisible? The obligation is still indivisible and S must deliver the whole car on November 15 or November 30. A definite thing like a car cannot be severed into parts without altering its essence or destroying its value. It is essential condition of the fitness of a thing to be divisible. That is possible by uniting the diverse portions thereof to reconstruct it as if it existed before its division. Let's move on to kinds of division. First is the quantitative. The division is quantitative when the thing can be materially divided into parts, and such parts are homogeneous to each other, such as when the parts are separated from each other, as in the case of movables, or when the limits of the parts are fixed by metes and bounds, as in the case of immovables. Example here is the obligation of X to deliver 10 obligations and contracts booked to B and C. The example for quantitative is if the inheritance consists only of a rice field is proportioned by metes and bounds into two equal parts is a quantitative division. Another example is when A and B divide 300 canvas of palay harvested from the rice field or the 100 million cash. Next is the qualitative. The division is qualitative when the thing can be materially divided, but the parts are not homogeneous to each other, such as in the partition of an inheritance. The example here, A and B are heirs of C. They agreed to divide the inheritance as follows. To A, a house and lot and home appliances, and to B, a rice fields, a car, and a 100 million cash. The last one is the ideal or intellectual. The division is ideal or intellectual when the thing can only be separated into ideal or undivided parts, not material parts as in the case of co-ownership. We also have an example for ideal or intellectual. Suppose the car and the rice field in the first example were inherited by both A and B. As co-owners, their one-half shares in the car are not separable in a material way, but only mentally. Similarly, before the land is actually divided between A and B, they are merely co-owners, and neither one of them can say that he is the absolute owner of a specific portion thereof. We already know the divisible obligation and the indivisible obligation, and also the kinds of division.
Article 1224 states that adjoint indivisible obligations give rise to indemnity for the damages from the time any one of the debtors does not comply with his undertaking. The debtors who may have been ready to fulfill their promises shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the thing, or of the value of the service in which the obligations consist. So, adjoint indivisible obligations. When we say adjoint indivisible obligations, the debtors are bound only to the extent of their share in the obligations, which can only be performed totally or complete, not partially. So, for example, X and Y, who are a popular duet, are jointly bound to sing in a concert organized by Z. So, a joint indivisible obligations gives rise to the indemnity for damages. When we say indemnity, indemnity means it is a comprehensive form of insurance compensation for the damages or loss. When the term indemnity is used in the legal sense, it may also refers to an exemption from the liability. Effect of breach of a joint indivisible obligation. So it is stated there that in case of breach of a joint indivisible obligations, it is converted into an indemnity for the damages. The joint debtors who failed or refused to comply with his obligation shall bear the burden of paying all the damages to the creditor or the joint creditor. So it is also stated there that for those joint debtors who may have been ready to comply with their obligation shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the thing or the value of the service in which the obligations consist. So, for example, X and Y, who are a popular duet, are jointly bound to sing in a concert organized by Z. So, X at the time when they were already bound to comply with their promise, X went missing. Nevertheless, Y was not so and in fact was ready to perform. If all the expenses to cover the concert and damages required by Z is amounting to 1 million peso, what is left for Y to do? So Y can pay 500,000 peso, this amount to correspond to the proportion of the value of the service in which the obligations consist. Next is Article 1225. It is stated there that for the purpose of the preceding articles, obligations to give definite things and those who are not susceptible of partial performance shall be deemed to be indivisible. When the obligation has for its object the execution of a certain number of days' work, the accomplishment of work by metrical units, or analogous things which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance, it shall be divisible. However, even though the object or service may be physical divisible, an obligation is indivisible if so provided by law or intended by parties. An obligation not to do, divisibility or indivisibility, shall be determined by the character of the prestation in each particular case. So, in the first paragraph, it is stated there that for the purpose of the preceding articles, obligations to give definite things and to those which are not susceptible of the partial performance should be deemed to be indivisible. So, according to the Article 1225, obligations are deemed indivisible when the obligation to give definite things. So, it is based on the nature of the subject matter. So, for example, the obligation of X to give his only laptop to Y. So, next is the obligations are deemed indivisible when the obligations which are not susceptible of the partial performance. So, when the performance should be performed one time as a whole. For example, the obligation of X to conduct a one-day lecture on the obligations and contracts. So in the second paragraph, when the obligations has for its object the execution of a certain number of days of work, the accomplishment of work by metrical units, or the analogous things which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance. It shall be divisible. So, according to Article 1225, the obligations are deemed divisible when 1. The obligation which have for their object the execution of a certain number of days of work. So, for example, the obligation of X to clean the house of Y in 2 days. Next is the obligations which have for their object to accomplishment of work by the metrical units. For example, the obligation of X to make a cabinet 2 feet wide and 6 feet long. And lastly is the obligations which by the nature are susceptible of partial performance. Like for example, the obligation of X to pay Y the amount of 100,000 peso in 4 equal monthly installment. And in the third paragraph, however, even though the object or the service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible if so provided by law or intended by parties. So it is stated there that the obligations provided by law to be indivisible when even if the thing or the service is physically divisible. So obligations are deemed indivisible if the law states that the obligations is indivisible, even though by their nature they are divisible. Like for example, payment of tax. Next is the obligations intended by the parties to be indivisible even the thing or the service is physically divisible. So when the parties wants the obligations should be indivisible or perform one at a time, like for example, the obligation of X to give 23,000 to Y on January 20, 2022. In the last paragraph, it is stated there that in the obligation not to do, divisibility or indivisibility shall be determined by the character of the prestation in each particular case. So, divisibility or indivisibility in obligation not to do. So, in negative obligation not to do, the character of the prestation in each particular case shall be determined their divisibility or indivisibility. Like, for example, in the indivisible obligation, X is obliged himself to Y not to sell cigarettes in his store for 1 year. Here, the obligations should be fulfilled continuously during a certain period. In the divisible obligation, example, if the obligation of X is to not sell cigarettes in his stores only during Sundays and holidays, the obligation is divisible because the forbearance is not continuous.
Audio Jungle.